you should look at flu control from both sides of the equation. In one end, you want to help increase that immunity and that resistance of the animals. And I think you do that for the most part using vaccines. And on the other end, you want to decrease that risk of transmission. And then you do that with biosecurity practices. So for me, flu control, you have to work in both sides of the equation, vaccines and management or biosecurity.
Swine.
Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Montserrat Torremorell, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Veterinary Population Medicine. Monsi, good morning. How are you today?
Very good, Laura. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're glad to have you on this morning, Monsi. You and I know each other from quite a ways back, but there might be some people on our broadcast this morning that may not know much about you. And so maybe I'll have you start with first introducing yourself to our listeners.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So who is Montserrat, right? So as you said, now I work at the University of Minnesota, and I've been there since 2009. So I came in the middle of a pandemic, 2009, the swine influenza pandemic. That's how they were calling it before that, at that time. But before that, actually, I worked at PIC, where I was there for 10 years. And I had different roles in terms of health assurance, global director. I got involved in research. So I got a good exposure to the swine industry. And to work in the swine industry had always been my dream, to be honest. And I had that opportunity to do that at PIC, which was great. To work in the US and then also to work globally. And before that, actually, I was at the University of Minnesota, where that's where I did my graduate work. That's where I obtained my PhD to understand the transmission of diseases, actually, under the advisorship of Dr. Carlos Pijuan. And as you can notice, I have an accent, so I'm originally from Spain. That's where I got my DVM degree, and that's where actually I am from a very small area in Spain, or a small town in Spain, in an area which I call it the Iowa of Spain when it comes down to pigs, right? It's Lleida. So I had always an interest in pigs, and I grew up raising 3 pigs at home, my family, but those were for own consumption. So that's how it was back then. But that's where actually I could see myself working in the industry. And I like medicine and I like production. So I thought this was a good fit. So when I had the opportunity to come to the US to further my education, to learn more about swine diseases, I took it. And since then, it's history. So that's what I do. And then since I've been at the University of Minnesota, 2009, I developed a research program, an applied research program focusing on the control of infectious diseases, mostly influenza, and also PRRS. When I was at PIC, I was involved on the efforts to get rid of PRRS virus, so I have that in my background, and I felt like we needed to do something similar for influenza. And there wasn't a lot of information then. So my research program a lot developed on understanding influenza at the farm level, and then with the goal to design better control and eventually elimination projects for influenza. But also when you think about diseases and controlling diseases, you also have to think about keeping them out. So I do have a bit of a interest, or a passion, I should say, not just interest, on airborne diseases, so diseases that can be transmitted through the air from a biosecurity perspective. So that's what I like to do. I like to study diseases and then put that knowledge to practice and bring components of disease epidemiology and disease control and prevention.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that's probably where I know you the best, is through some of the work that you've done with flu and aerosol transmission. And So I think let's really talk about that today. We are doing this podcast in winter, and we always talk about how winter is the great time to pass diseases around. So let's pick on flu today a little bit, and maybe let's just start with some of the typing. So some of our listeners may hear of H1N1 or H3N1, and right, we have bird flu, and we have strains for human flu, and pigs have strains. But what do these all mean to people? How do we kind of start to break it apart?
Yeah, I consider flu one of those viruses that I actually think if flu had a brain, I would say that it's very smart, right? Because it knows how to adapt and change and keeps changing. And because it changes so much, we have to in some way learn to classify it and put it in groups. So that's where we talk about type A influenza, and within the type A, which is basically the one that affects pigs for the most part, and pigs and people, for the most part, we have what you mentioned before, H1N1, H1N2s, H3s and 2s. Those would be subtypes. And that's another way to classify the flu virus according to the proteins, the surface proteins that the virus has. But what is interesting is that these proteins keep changing, right? The virus has to keep adapting, has to be able to move to another host and move to other pigs. And then even though we say there are three main subtypes of influenza, then within each of them, there are millions, I would say, or thousands or hundreds, depending on how you want to look at it, of different types of influenza viruses, different strains. And that's where the challenge comes in when we think in terms of the control, because some of the vaccines we have can just not give you protection against all the types of influenza because the virus keeps adapting, right? So that's one of the challenges of influenza, but it's also what makes it so fascinating too. And then on top of that, when you really think about influenza, it's what we call a segmented virus, has 8 different segments. And what it means is that when different viruses are together in the same cell and then they replicate, they can exchange those gene segments. And then that can give place to new viruses. And that's what we call the new reassortant viruses. And then that's actually another very smart way that the virus has to evolve and persist in populations. So just to make things a bit more complicated for veterinarians and producers and public health, as I said, influenza is very smart when it comes down to finding ways to live in the populations.
Absolutely. It's very interesting. And I think some of our readers may be a little bit familiar with what happens in people. Just because, again, if they're getting their flu shots and they hear about this strain or that strain. But what I'm hearing you say is it happens the same in pigs as it does in people. We can have different strains, different assortments, and maybe some of our flu vaccinations that we have available for pigs aren't necessarily going to be as effective for some of our strains of flu as maybe some of our others. Would that be fair?
Yeah, certainly it is. I mean, I think to me there are two things that happen. One, in pigs, we have new strains coming into the pigs, that many of these strains come from people who are infected, that then they just happen to be working with the pigs. And this has happened forever, I would think. But now we perhaps see more. We have better ways to diagnose, or better tools to figure out that part. But also, as you said, the control when we use about vaccines, we need what with vaccines you try to do is to control what you have, not what it will come, because you don't know what it will come, right? So that's what you're trying to do. So flu gets a bit complicated because of that reason, and that's one of the needs why flu vaccines need to be updated on a regular basis.
Absolutely. So I heard you briefly just state a comment in there about the fact that a person could be working on the farm that currently is flu positive, and those flu virus particles, if you will, can get reassorted within the pig. And so people can actually be a form of transmission to the pig. How else can flu be transmitted within a farm or to a farm?
Yeah, so certainly other animals, like obviously pigs, the replacement animals that we may be brought it in if they don't go through an isolation and we don't let them enough time to in some way go through the infection or resolve the infection, then it can also be a very good source of virus to the farm. And actually, in a study that we did, that was one of the main ways how um, viruses new viruses would come into farms, the gills, or at least they have the potential. I'm not saying all the gills will bring influenza, but they can if they come from positive farms. So you have to handle those gills so that the infection is self-contained in the isolation if you can. But then what happens is that I think it's very interesting with influenza, which is slightly different than other diseases like PRRS, is that inside the sow farms are really a very good place for influenza to stay and get maintained, right? Because you have the adult population, the sows, that basically they actually once they've gone through the infection and once they've recovered, they are not a main source of the virus. The virus is actually in the piglets. But remember, the piglets are born negative with influenza, which is different than for PRRS. We think often I think we make the mistake to think that influenza and PRRS behave very, very similarly. And in some instances they do, but in some other instances they don't. And that's one of the main differences I want to point out, that influenza virus, the pigs they are not born with the influenza virus. But that means that all that population is fully naive because they don't have even antibodies against influenza when they are born. The antibodies from the mother, they acquire them, through colostrum, so shortly after birth. And that immunity, it's not always totally protective. It helps clinically, but sometimes depending on the quantity and the quality of those antibodies, the virus is still able to replicate, right, and transmit. So actually, that population, the piglets, it's recruits. It's great to recruit new virus infections, really, and that's one of the main challenges. And we've seen often that in those 21 days that those piglets stay at the farm, right, from birth to weaning, you can go from having 0% pigs positive at birth to 100%. So one question that we have to ask ourselves is then, how do those pigs get infected during that time when it does not come from the sows? And we've looked into that quite extensively, in which sows, when they farrow, for the most part, they are not the main source of the virus, right? So that we did different investigations, and you know this, Laura, right? That, and we see that in humans, flu is very contagious, right? So actually, that indirect transmission of the flu virus, it happens very often. And what it means is that people's in the hands, contaminated materials, even mixing it, if we do cross fostering with pigs that are positive, they are a very good source of influenza virus. We even documented that the north sows, that we need them, those sows that we take at weaning, that they already raised their litter. If those sows raise a litter that was influenza positive, we've documented that the skin of those sows, in the udder, then the underline, can have contaminated or can have viable influenza. So if then you put another litter that it's fully naive to suckle from those cells, then that's another way how influenza gets maintained. So that's just an example about how easy it is to move influenza within a cell farm.
Right. Yeah, so as a producer now, I'm scared, right? I'm kind of maybe flustered too as to what do I do, right? So you're telling me my pigs are born negative. They're not getting it in utero as they would PRRS. And I'm probably through employees, equipment, potentially nurse sows. I'm introducing flu to them and then creating potentially 100% positive piglets when they leave the farm. So what do we do? What can we do to kind of put a stop in that process?
Very good question. And actually, we've looked into that in pieces, right? Because we sometimes, again, thinking in that purse mentality, we say, well, what about if we do very good microbial, very good biosecurity practices of no cross-fostering, no movement of animals, even limiting the north-south, for instances, or even changing gloves? Is that good enough? And actually, our data from the farms where we have investigated that, it shows that it's not good enough. That when we implement only biosecurity measures like that, if there is a lot of influenza in the population, so if the farm is a farm that has a lot of influenza, that's not good enough. What those measures do is to delay that infection, but it's not enough to actually get to a point that the piglets are WIN negative. On the other end, we talked about vaccines before. We also have seen that vaccines on their own are very helpful to actually, again, delay that infection, right? Delay that infection and take care of the clinical signs. Pigs look better. They don't cough as much. And they have less virus because that immunity helps, but may not be enough. Where we actually, I think, the opportunity is when we combine both, when we combine vaccination and strategies of internal biosecurity. That's where we have seen the success of actually trying to eliminate or try to win a negative pig. But thinking in terms of implementing an elimination project, I would encourage producers and veterinarians to look at those two pieces. And when you do that, even those strict biosecurity protocols, they don't need to be there forever. It's just a very targeted intervention during that time that that you're trying to focus on breaking that cycle of transmission. Because again, the other thing with influenza that it's different with PRRS, it's when the pig is infected individually. Usually, it stays the infection in the pig short periods, let's say 1 week. At the population level, it's longer than that. So we have to find a way to break that infection at the population level. That's why when we implement some of these protocols, we talk about 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. But we don't have to go to the extreme that we do for PRRS about the closure of the 9 months or 10 months, because influenza, if we take care of some of the other things on the transmission side of things, it just doesn't persist that long at the population level. And obviously, if you do spend the time to look into the vaccination and some of these management practices from a biosecurity perspective, then obviously what you do with your gills become very important too, because you don't want to start introducing new viruses. So I think those are 3 pieces that a producer can do that help decrease that, at least the load of influenza virus, and hopefully with that help get rid of some of the strains. Because the other thing that happens is in these farms, we tend to have more than one strain of virus. And then often we don't know until we control one, then we see the other one surface, right? So it becomes a bit of a puzzle. But it's also interesting that some strains die out on their own. We don't know why, but they die out. Maybe others take over, right? So to me also, but this is more of a philosophical question, and I don't know how to get there, but maybe it's a challenge for the industry, is also looking to, is there a way how when we look into controlling influenza, of eliminating, trying to get rid of that diversity of virus, right? Because if we had less diversity, we had less strains circulating in a farm, it certainly would be easier to target a vaccine, for instance, right? So I think there is some work that we need to do that and expand that work to the grow finish area after we wean the pigs, because that's where actually 90% of the pigs in the US are in grow finish. And I don't think we do enough on that area. And I don't have the answer on what to do there yet. But we certainly, at the same time, we have to start in the sow farm. So
absolutely. So one of the questions that just came to mind was, you were talking about diversity of the strains within the sow farm. Have you ever measured the amount of diversity in sow farms versus grow finish? Meaning, do we see more diversity in grow finish than what we do in the sow barns?
Oh, that's a very good question. We haven't actually, no, we haven't done it that way. But if the diversity in the sow farms is can be significant, it's not uncommon to find three different lineages working over time or at a time. Um, we've documented that multiple times. I think in grow finish, depending on how you manage, and on grow finish, you have to also define what's your population, right? The good thing about grow finish is many of those win to finish sites or nurseries or finishing sites are all in allowed. That actually by default helps you from that diversity, right? Or it should help you, but I don't think we've looked into it. That's actually a good question, Laura. And then you're challenging us to do that research to figure out that part. But I can tell you, we are actually right now doing a study in which we are collecting samples from sow farms and grow finish, and the sow farms get commingled at weaning the piglets, and it's common to find multiple subtypes in the same population, right? And then going back to what I was saying before on how this virus change, in this study in particular, we are looking for reassortance. So we're looking at the possibility of finding new viruses when you mix viruses or when you mix pigs from sources that they have different viruses. So we are actually right now doing that study, trying to document and quantify how many new viruses, if you will, there could be a population, the nursery and in the finishing site, when they all originate from the same sow farm. So we are in the sample collection stages. I don't have an answer, but I think I can tell you, I think already for what we are seeing, the results will be interesting. And unfortunately, I think we are going to find multiple combination of these viruses. Then some will disappear of the population, but some others likely will have that capacity to continue to replicate and then transmit forward if they have the opportunity. So stay tuned.
Oh, that's actually really interesting. I think that'll be certainly fun to read and hear about. You also had mentioned somewhere in your conversation just a little bit ago, we were talking a bit about eliminating flu from a herd. And I think that's something that I've seen over years too, is where we try a flu elimination. And like you said, we don't feel it was successful because we probably eliminated one of the three strains that's predominant on the farm and the other two just take over. So my question, I guess, kind of goes back to what do we do with that? Because I do see people today where they're almost just saying, okay, well, we understand we're going to have flu. We're always going to have flu. And so I don't see flu always being a winter disease anymore, right? I've seen herds coming in with piglets flu positive in summer and so forth. And so what's the implication of that? Is that the right approach? Should we be doing something different there?
Yeah, you alluded to that a couple of times, and I didn't elaborate on that. That actually, even though we see more flu in the winter and the fall, flu is there year around, unfortunately. Again, because we have these populations of animals like the piglets that help maintain that infection. So we continue winning positive pigs. So that's important. So I think from the producer perspective, we need to look at the flu control programs, part of the standard protocols. I don't think we should just do them when we see a flu outbreak. Personally, I think they should be there on an ongoing basis. And I think vaccinations, it's one tool that we should be using in the sow farms. As frustrating as it is sometimes that we have to update vaccines, what I think it's even more frustrating is having naive populations that then just help attract those viruses, right? So I think that's one of the things we can do. But obviously, then the devil is on the details because there is a lot of different flu vaccines or how you determine And but I would start with assessing what happens at the farm, because even not all the farms are the same. Different production systems are they have different protocols, and then try to quantify the impact that the flu might have in your system, because I don't think we have good numbers either. And the other thing that is frustrating with influenza, which just makes it more complicating and more difficult for the producer to really decide what to do, is again because we have this genetic variation. Not all the flu strains are the same from an impact of the disease. Some flu strains you could argue that are very mild, and why would you invest any funds in trying to control them? Probably you don't need to. But there are other flu strains that are really, really even killing the animals, not just causing some type of cough, and that's it. And the same happens in humans, right? There are some seasons like this. For whatever reason, I think this year it's rampant. That we do have flu viruses that really, unfortunately, cause a lot of losses. And other years they don't. And I think we have some of the same in pigs, but I can see how it's frustrating because we call it influenza in general, when in reality there are those different types, and some they are, more costly and more difficult to control. But to the producer, I would say, or to the veterinarian, to me, we cannot forget about influenza. We should not just take it in consideration when we have an outbreak. I think there are things we can do from a employee perspective, encouraging vaccination, having some biosecurity practices. I think there are things we can do that they are just good public health practices that we should do it anyways. So, yeah, and I think some of the strategies will not just be good for influenza, they will be good for other viral diseases that may be in the population when you think about biosecurity, right?
Absolutely. I think that's something we learned with PED. When we were trying to control PED, we saw other diseases, at least on the sow farm, kind of slow down and be quiet for about 6 months or so until after your PED protocols were complete. And so I agree. Good biosecurity, good hygiene on the farm certainly can go a long ways.
Yeah. One of the things I forgot to mention before, that a recent finding we found, again, this flu transmits very easily. We find in the hands of employees, in the clothes of employees. And we saw in these farms that they have a lot of flu, again, in those sow farms. Those events that happen at weaning, whether it's vaccination or loading, those are main risk events for moving the virus to the younger animals. So one thing easy that we could do, loading usually happens first thing in the morning. After loading, I think we should go ahead and change the coveralls and do a good washing of the hands and the forearms of the people involved on the loading or even the vaccination of the piglets at weaning. Because I'm pretty convinced that something like that decreases then the risk of moving the virus to the younger animals. And I'm using that as an example to illustrate to your question about what can the producer do. So I think small things like that help to break the cycle of transmission of these viruses. Not just flu, could also be PRRS or sometimes even the mycoplasma, if you're trying to eliminate mycoplasma from your farm. But at the same time, it's not just one thing, right? It's the vaccination, is the, good practices around processing, it's all those different pieces that for the most part, I think they are done quite well from a production perspective, but we just have to also look at them from the virus perspective and then try to maybe be a bit more conscious about some of those practices so we can prevent that transmission.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. One of the things I heard many years ago, and I don't know if this was folklore or if this is real, but I had always heard that flu will stay in your nasal passages for about 7 days. And so even blowing your nose when you come to the farm or after you've worked with a group of flu positive pigs, you should go ahead and do that. What's your take on that one?
On the people, I don't know on people, but we actually, for how long, right? But yeah, if you are infected, certainly 7 days, I think that would be very reasonable. But we did a study a couple of years ago in which employees would self-swab themselves, and that we were measuring exposure more than anything and try to assess how often employees would go to the farms with at least PCR positive in the nasal swabs. And we saw actually a number of employees being testing positive, going into the farm. So I don't know how many days, but 2-3 days, and I don't really know whether blowing the nose would be good enough. But there are other things we can do nowadays, right? We learn with COVID some of the masks, maybe the surgical mask, or even just the basic washing hands. But I think to your point, I think there are things in terms of those very basic hygiene principles, right? I insist washing hands, don't touch your nose, right, when you work. So I think that can go a long way. So
Well, Monty, our time is kind of wrapping up here. So maybe give our listeners a couple of key takeaway points that you would like for them to have from our podcast today.
yeah, so I think one of the take home is that I think you should look at flu control from both sides of the equation. In one end, you want to help increase that immunity and that resistance of the animals. And I think you do that for the most part using vaccines. And on the other end, you want to decrease that risk of transmission. And then you do that with biosecurity practices. So for me, flu control, you have to work in both sides of the equation, vaccines and management or biosecurity. So to me, that's a very important take-home message. And the other take-home message, I know it's frustrating, but I don't think we should um, stop trying and should be discouraged because we are still learning on some of those things. And if anything, I actually think we need to measure when we do any intervention to measure whether it's being effective. And that way we learn and we change and we adapt. So those, I think, would be my take-home messages for today.
Very good. Those are good messages.
It is time to our famous three.
Well, as you know, we like to ask our guest speaker a couple of questions. And so we'll start with the first one, which is, what's your favorite swine resource?
I'm a traditional when it comes to some of the information where I like to go and find good information. And I would say still the disease of swine I like for certain things, even though nowadays, yeah, you do a lot of Googling and, do databases and so on. But depending on the topic, I still go to the diseases of swine book. So I guess I will choose that one, but not all of it.
I went to reach for mine on last week and I realized I had left it at home and I was like, oh my gosh, I need my book. So I know that still my go-to as well. How about something that's not related to pigs? Are there any books that you've read recently that you might recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that question ahead so I could be prepared. But I'm reading this book, and I don't know how well you can see it. It's the Code Breaker, and it's about the life or the career of Jennifer Doudna, who is one of the pioneers on the CRISPR system that now allows for all the gene editing. It's written by Walter Isaacson, and I find it fascinating. I'm halfway through it, and I keep reading a little bit every day because I find that very fascinating. But, I encourage everybody to read it. It's very insightful in terms of what the CRISPR system can do from a gene editing and then the possibilities, but also talks about the research experience of a scientist, right? And the collaborations and some of the politics. I find it fascinating, so I would recommend that book.
Yeah, that sounds like a good book. I'll have to look at that one. My last question for you, Monsi, is if you can think of someone in your life that has been successful, and you define success however you want to define it, what would be a key trait that they've possessed that you think's allowed them to be successful?
Yeah, without naming a specific people, because I think sometimes this trait is across people and I would not want to leave anybody out. I think one trait that I admire is perseverance, to be persistent, if it was a right word, but to persevere. I think it's the right word. But also integrity. I think when those two go together, I think that goes a long way. I mean, because there are difficulties along the way. So, and then to make progress, you have to persist in some way. So you have to be that. I think it's perseverance, right? The right
Yes.
word to say it in
Perseverance.
English.
Yes.
Perseverance. So thank you.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
That's what I meant.
I knew what you said. Yep. So perseverance and integrity combined together. Yeah, I think those are great traits for sure. Well, Monty, I do see that our time is up today, and I greatly appreciate and enjoyed our conversation around flu and some of the things that we can do within the barn to help control it and potentially eliminate it. For our listeners, again, this is Dr. Montserrat Torremorell, who is at the University of Minnesota. Monty, thanks so much for your time today.
No, thank you, Laura. It's a great always to chat with you and to be part of your program. Thank you for having me.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.